right, guys, let's jump into it. If we could speak on any topic, answer any questions, what have you got in mind for us today? Who's going to kick us off?
I'll kick us off.
Jimmy.
Yes. Okay. All right, so you've shared the story in the past of where you would submit under your previous pastor's leadership and you had on your heart to plant your own church, but you would always submit to what he was to say on the issue. And you're at peace about it. What would you say to anyone here that is so convinced on a God word, but they don't trust what their leader is saying about their next steps?
Yeah.
Like, how do you toe that line of still being respectful and submitting under leadership, but also owning your calling?
Yeah. I think that's a really great question. And for me, my mind goes into a few things. You need to own your calling by living your calling, not arriving at it. Like, that's the first thing you got to do, right? Like, if your calling is a title or a job description or then I don't think that's your calling. That's like a milestone, that's a moment, but I think you've got to embrace your calling by living your calling. And then I think the second thing for me is I just kind of, I grew up in a time or went through that season in a time where probably the world wasn't as noisy. So there wasn't as many influences that were in my ear like you have these days. Like, it's on your screen, it's on TikTok, it's on Instagram, it's on Facebook. Some of the people are on Instagram, in Facebook and all the things. And so I think our opinions are far more put at the forefront these days than ever before. And I think that there's a lot of conversation around, well, what happens if the leader's toxic, or what happens if they're controlling? And I just had a pretty high measure of what that looked like based on David and Saul. And I also felt like what I was called to was so extreme that I wanted to put God's word to a really high measure and to a really high test. And so one of my biggest fears, because I came from a broken home, right? So this is as well, I think you got to know you. Like, I came from a broken home. I didn't have mum and dad split up when I was 8, and they went through their own drama with that, like trying to cope with it. So I was left to myself a lot. And so I had no one tell me anything from 8 on. Like, I was pretty much in charge of my life. And I did what I wanted to do. And even if I ever got in trouble, there wasn't any major ramifications. So that's why I became a problem to teachers and to all sorts of people. And so I remember sitting in the youth office, and I just felt like God just said to me, I was just sitting there and I wasn't even sure what was next. And I think I must have had some fear around submission, actually. And I remember God just said to me, he just asked me a question. He said, Chris, who can tell you no? And I only really didn't have anyone. There was no one that I'd given that authority to. And so I thought, well, okay, why don't I give it to my young adults pastor? And then immediately as I said that, a fear rose up, which is something for us to note, right? Like, sometimes you don't know what's hiding in you until you're standing at the precipice of a new jump, like of a new leap of faith. And so the minute I was like, okay, I'm going to submit to this person, I got afraid, and I thought, automatically, I just thought, what if they don't release me to what I'm made for? And God, because we're in a conversation, just retorted straight back. And he just said, if I was able to harden and soften man's heart to get my son to earth and to the cross, and David and Saul, then I can do that with you. He's not bigger than me. And so it ultimately didn't become about trusting my leader as much as trusting my God and trusting process and principle. And I also felt like I wanted to take this call and put it under an extremely high burden of proof. Yeah. Because I was like, man, I don't want to be doing this if it's not me, because it's like, at that point, it's just scary. There's so many people that do that. So I just felt like, wow, okay, if the leader is even more toxic, how much greater is the burden of proof that God's got to meet? And I just also thought of David, like David had Saul. And I love that David even went to the point of saying, like, I will not touch the Lord's anointed. David was really, really, really good with understanding that whilst he might be anointed, he wasn't appointed, and that appointment was in God's hands. And I think appointment is something that we set in times and things like that. And I think that becomes really troublesome because there's no formula to it. I think it's crazy when we say things like, I should be doing it by now. I think if you're living your calling and being faithful with what you do, what you should be doing at what time is up to God. And I think that when you start to put measures of when you should be preaching and when you should be leading and when you should do X, Y, and Z, I think what you would do is you mistake your anointing. And in a world that is always going to offer opportunity, opportunity doesn't always equal appointment. And I think if you don't have leaders over you as a safeguard that are making decisions with you, and you don't trust God enough to move on them, then what I think you then do is you end up with very dishonest leaders because they know that you're just going to kick back or it's going to become collateral. Or you end up with people that aren't there to help you. And the Bible says plans fail through the lack of wise counsel. And I just felt like, man, okay, I'm obviously not in this church thing because people are flawless. I'm in this church thing because my God is. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to trust God with this. And I'll tell you what it did do for me, Jimmy. I felt like you watch this thing in King Saul where the minute he's just mentioned by Samuel that he's screwed it up and that God's no longer for him, he just instantly goes insane. He goes like, and he questions everything. It's like, and he's trying to go to seers and he's trying to go to everybody because it's kind of like, oh, and what that translated the way I felt when I read that. And years later, I was reminded when I was walking the streets in Chicago through some of our hardest seasons, was like, it felt like, man, this is failing because God's not in it. And the only comfort I took in some of our most difficult seasons leading was that, thank God I never left from under my pastor's leadership, as wild as he was, from a perspective of just taking it into my own hands. Because every moment our giving went down or we lost leaders or we almost lost a building, I definitely would have interpreted it as consequential because of what I did. Whereas what I knew was a test because of what I did. And so I worked it that way. I think that, I don't know, I think we limit God a lot. And we honestly elevate the giant in front of us. And the giant sometimes is like a toxic leader or angry leader or controlling. But then at the same time, how do you know that they are being controlling? Sometimes, what if they just don't think it's your time? And I just found comfort. That's how I lived it. It's what I believe. I actually sat with when he, because he sat with me too, and he said to me, when he came back to America this one time, he's like, hey, so I'm going to shut down America, all the country. I'm going to shut down our campus here, and you get a choice to either go where you want to go, stay here, or come home. And in Aussie culture, yeah, this is a very heavy concept in Aussie culture. Not so much I've found here in America as much of a culture within the church. And I just was like, I thought this conversation was going to happen in a year from now. And I remember thinking, all right, I guess this is my point to put the fleece out there, and I'm just going to say it. And let's pause there for a second and re-go to the first time I ever go to church at 14. I think I'm made to do this. Not because I know what it is, but just it's what came out of me. As soon as I saw my pastor preach, I was like the senior pastor, I was like, what an honor it would be. What an honor it would be to preach your word. And then small confirmations along the way. But I constantly put that calling on the altar. Because I just felt like, who doesn't think that they're made for something like that quite often? And how do I know I don't want it for selfish reasons? And it wasn't until I was actually sitting in Palatine in my room and I'd heard some stuff happen, because our old church that Jimmy and I came from kind of dissipated, heard some unhealthy things that were really coming out. And I remember being so frustrated, and I felt like, God, like, you got to talk to me. Is this the vision I'm meant to serve for the rest of my life? Or am I meant to be what you said I'm meant to be? And something happened in that as I wrestled with God, and I think I finally expressed without fear that I've never wanted it for the wrong motive. And then I said, well, God, you got to confirm it. Within 3 days, 3 people came up to me and said, hey, what would you do if you were asked to stay, go back, or lead your own? Odds was the first person, and I just said, don't be stupid, that's crazy. But in my mind, I was like, that's burden of proof, number 1. And then number 2, number 3 happened. I believe in threes. And then I was like, okay, we'll see what happens. But I thought that was confirmed. And another year from now, my pastor did a surprise visit. We're at this little kind of Irish pub, and, we're talking, and he asked me that question. So I'm like, and I just answered it this way. I said, look, this is what I felt, and you need to know, and you do know me by now, that if you think that what I am telling you is not God, and I'm not capable of it, or not called to it, and anointed for it, you know that you can tell me, and I will kill it here today, and you will never have to wonder whether I will split our church, or whether I will leave, or anything. This is my moment to put it to you. And I said, honestly, I think if I do that well, you're responsible for my calling, and I've been faithful to what I'm meant to do. And that's when he said, we've always seen it on your life. I'm like, you wish you would have told me that a bit earlier. But that's how I walked it out. So I think people have had crazier, worse scenarios. I think my scenario was somewhere in the middle, but that's how I worked it, and that's my belief on it. And I think we got lots of biblical and cultural and historical aspects of, as we pull apart the Bible, that we could look at that same scenario is kind of at play.
How do you view it from the other lens of you're the leader and somebody's telling you, hey, God said, or how do you navigate that kind of dynamic first?
Yeah, I think for me, we hold that with a lot of trepidation. I do not want to be in the way of someone's calling. Here's a great rule on that. You often don't display in your leadership what you didn't understand in your fellowship. So if you don't get it as a follower, you don't do it as a leader. Because I understood the power of that and the weight of that, well, as a leader, it never left me. And again, I feel that, you know what I mean? And so I really look at it, I'm like, I'm not getting in the way of anybody's calling. My job is to promote and to propel and to push people into what they're made for. But at some point, you also need to protect people from what they're not made for. But people need to choose to come under that in order for you to protect them. You're not Superman protecting as a vigilante. You know what I mean? You're genuinely there to take your role as leader serious and as shepherd. And I think a few things in the way that hangs out is, number 1, every single thing and every single person you lead must be led like this, with an open hand. Yes. I think the minute your grip starts tightening, that person is fulfilling a false sense of security in both your leadership and ministry. You think you need them more than you do. And that sounds like, oh, you're being flippant with them. No, it's actually the key to not controlling someone is to not thinking you need them as much as you think you do. Understanding that God is still God. Jesus is the head of his church. Holy Spirit will call his workers because God is the Lord of the harvest. That's what we have to believe. When we believe that, then we can actually really open people and go, okay, you are whatever you need. So that's our posture. But the second thing is the invitation has to be there by way of, I think I've heard God, but as a spiritual oversight, mentor, and part of my board, your so to speak board, I want to know what you think, because that's how I'm going to know that this is confirmation for me. So before I married Audrey, I went to my pastor, I went to my grow group leader, I spoke to my family, and I spoke to my boys, the dudes that were really running with me. And I was all like, hey guys, is there any blind spot I don't see? What do you guys feel? What do you guys feel? And what I loved is that most of them were on the consensus of hey, we don't have any red check engine lights going on here. We can't tell you who the right one is, but we can tell you who the wrong one is. The rest is up to you. And so I had a counsel in that same way. I think, sometimes you can ask for feedback and the person across from you knows you don't want feedback. And sometimes people don't want to include you in the process of, hey, can you, because I respect you and because I am not fearful of the wrong outcome, I will include you in it. And I will just say to you, hey, what do you feel? I think it's God. And honestly, sometimes that conversation isn't even about a finite moment. It's actually sometimes a journey. Sometimes what's not God yesterday is God tomorrow. You know what I mean? They didn't always get ready to cross over into the promised land. Sometimes there were seasons of waiting. So I think you got to kind of ask yourself, do I trust God? If I trust God, I can trust my leader. And as my, and I think if you're not afraid of hearing a no, then you're really truly going to be faithful to the test. And that's my question to anybody with a calling and to a direction. Are you going to be faithful to the test? Because you really, really, really have confidence that it's been spoken. Because if you really believe it's spoken, you'll keep putting it before God and before leaders and before people and in time. So I had 3 or 4 conversations with my leader. Now, I think, in retrospect, I possibly would have had those conversations different as a leader than my leader had them with me. But I did. I put the fleece out a few times. I was like, and it was mainly out of frustration. I just knew I wasn't made for what I was in. I wasn't good at any of the roles in the church. I was only good at the one role. And I was starting to out-age it. I can't be the youth pastor and be 70. So I was like out-aging the role, and I knew they didn't know where to put me, and I knew I didn't fit in some of the places they wanted me, and I knew my calling. But one thing I do appreciate about my pastor is that he was protective in the fact that he never was going to push. If there's one thing I knew from him, is if he said, I see this on your life, he never held back any punches. He never held back anything. And I had confidence that he believed in me. As harsh as it might have sounded. And he wasn't, my problem was never with harshness. My problem was more with some of the concepts that I would differ with. But I think it was like really, really like comforting to know that I had someone that would speak unfiltered truth. Yeah. And I always thought, I'm not afraid of that because God, if this is you, you'll bring it to pass. And here's something way down in leadership. How does that work with other things? It works with pregnancy. Like the minute any of you couples fall pregnant over 30, our medical system has this really encouraging banner for you, and it's called high risk. Yeah, it's awesome. You are deemed high risk. So how awesome is that? You just start hearing all the odds. And honestly, after every kid, there was more that could go wrong. Not just by age, but because I think science knows so much now that ignorance was bliss. Yeah. Now they're like, oh, we got a test. What's this test for? It's the 17 toes test. Really? There's a 17 toes test? Yeah, there's a 17 toes test. Like, it's all these things, and you're like freaking out. But hey, if God has already predestined my son or daughter to be, nothing will stand against it. You know where else it kicks in? When you've been 12 years mobile and you're looking for a building and you start to hear all these things like alderman after alderman say no. And then you go, you know what? If God is for me, no one can be against me. If this is to be my building. And in the concept of homecoming and rest, like how do you rest in your calling and not fret over your calling? Well, simple. If God is for it, you sit in that. And you understand that if you read every character in the Bible, there is not one age of graduation towards your calling. So yeah, include people, I think, in it.
I think from my perspective in that time period, I was on staff and then came off staff when I fell pregnant with Cruz. And Chris was part of the exec. And in that, like, church was booming. I loved the people. I loved where we were living, but there was a lot of the leadership mindset and core values that I really struggled with. And in my mind, I was like, man, I love this, but I'm conflicted. And in that, for me, it was never an option or a question whether I would leave, because it was like, God has called us here. But then there was the conflict of, man, they don't release, or that's not part of their culture. So if I even wanted to leave or escape this, and the only way to do that was to get sent and not went, I'm stuck here forever. So a part of me had to like just be okay with the season, because it wasn't about submitting to crazy leaders as much as it was about God and his word and planting us there. So when that settled in, God was so gracious to Chris and I and how he took us out of that environment, because it wasn't toxic. It wasn't through a church split. It wasn't us getting, crazy and just abandoning everything. God literally called us out. and he did it in the most gracious way and did it through our leaders. So if some of you are in a place where you're feeling a little bit like, I think God is calling me out, but I don't know, and I obviously want to live under that same value of being sent, just remember that at the end of the day, what is for you is for you.
Yeah.
And if God is in control, he will fabricate and orchestrate that moment for you to step into that new season. And he'll do it in the most graceful way ever. And I think it shouldn't have to happen off the back of a church split or getting offended or this or that. It could just be by his grace and by his calling that he'll pull you out. So just wait in that and rest in that. And when you do, whatever he's called you to, he will bring to fruition.
Yeah. And then I think with what Ord said, as us as leaders, how do we stand in this for everyone that gets like, oh gosh, what about, I don't know. We'll never stand in your way. You know what I mean? Like, if you're like, man, I want to go do whatever you want to do, and you ask us for advice and whether we feel like it's God or whatever, like, we're not gonna, we'll tell you. But let's say after that, if anyone under our leadership is ever like, well, I don't really align with it, or I still think it is, we're not going to wrestle you to the ground. You know what I mean? We're not going to be like, that's part of leading open-handed, right? I think sometimes you feel like a responsibility, or maybe, I think that's where it borders control, is if you start getting to, like tackling and wrestling them down and no, well, I won't release, or I won't give you a recommendation. I'm like, listen, there's probably things I won't do because I don't, maybe completely align with it, but I'm not going to sabotage. I'm not going to make it difficult. I'm not going to make it, that's not the goal. I think at that point, you've now really, you're manipulating it or you're whatever. But as a culture, we also have to understand the difference between honest feedback.
That's what I'm saying. You've got to let us be honest.
Yeah, if you can't be honest, you shouldn't even ask the question if someone can't be honest.
You got to let us be honest and hit you with the truth.
Yeah.
And if you can take it, and if, then I think that whatever, as long as we can be honest, we'll be always releasing.
I think that's a good rule for everyone too. You got to build your marriage on that construct. Don't ask questions that you don't want to hear answers to. Yes.
I think more so, to be honest, take this whatever. I think many of you could probably speak to this. In your seasons, like I'm particularly thinking your season of you're leading a church. It's a booming season. You've got really young children, and you're building a house, and you're doing like 50,000 things. I think my question is like I genuinely think a bunch of you could speak to it. Like in your seasons of like biggest capacity stretch, how do you with the leadership mindset, lead, like staying super firm and super strong and super level-headed and just continuing forward while God is clearly just doing a big capacity stretch season. So I'm not even sure the advice I would be seeking in that, but there are seasons where there's a lot of capacity stretching at once, and then I feel like we're always having our capacity stretch, but some seasons it seems more doable.
Yeah.
And other seasons it seems oh, holy heck, this is taffy being stretched. So,
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. What do the Colazos think? Or you're a Colazo.
They just built a house to
That was a hard season, to be honest. I think just acknowledging that it was a hard season was kind of freeing for me, because I think sometimes you think that you'll just have it all together and that things will be easy and my timeline will be my timeline and that's what I expect, right? And when things get out of that kind of perfect world, right, for us it felt like it was difficult. I wouldn't say the world came crashing down, but it was difficult.
Yeah.
But I would say one thing that we held, and still to this day, hold to is that, kind of going back to what you said, is what God has for us is for us.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And that He's going to see me through this season. And there, I think sometimes you get so hyper focused on right now, and you forget the big picture. And that's what it was man, if we could just be out of this apartment or out of this basement or all of these things, and it was just there was just so many things that I was missing in that season because I was too focused on the next season health for me, and then it was going to be bigger, and it was going to be better, and all of those things. And I even get caught up in that sometimes with like a church building. I'm like, I can't wait till we have our building and all of these things. But I was talking to someone this morning, and I think it as a leader, it makes me plateau because I'm not looking to press forward or go farther or lean on God more or like to let Him fill the gap of my weakness. What I'm trying to do is say, hey, I'm just going to survive with the bare minimum. I'm not leaning on, and what that is I'm not leaning on God anymore. You know what? I'm leaning on just survival and what I can do, right?
Yeah.
I think when you start pressing into God in those moments and not squeezing everything out of those seasons, like what it built in me was resilience. What it built in me was something that no man could ever take away from me, and that was faith in God, right? Because we had no reason to think that like this house would ever get done. In fact, it felt like the opposite, right? I would show up there day after day after day after day after day, and nothing was done. And it was so discouraging, but somehow God kept my head above water. Somehow God kept instilling faith in me and resilience, and and all these things that can be translated into like different parts of my life that I'll never like take for granted. Like the things that God built in me in that season, like I've seen it. I'll like work out in every part of my life after that season. It's like, God, if you didn't take me through this season, would I be able to endure the next season, right? Like, building a house was hard, but finding out that Indy was going through her season was much, much harder, right? So like there was an endurance, there was a resilience, there was a faith in God that season built, that pursued me, and it carried over into that next season, and it propelled me even further, and it built a deeper conviction. So I think remembering that God is doing something, even though it seems chaotic, even though it seems like it's never going to go away, even though it feels like, God, why? There's like a purpose, and there's something being built. And when I focused on that, I started to realize that, God, your ways and the way you're doing is far bigger than I can comprehend. And I spoke about it a little bit in the message where it's like, we have this little like view of God, right? But yet He built the universe and the galaxies and all of these things. But I'm so focused on this little thing that He's got doing for me. I think He's got it figured out. So I have to tell myself, like, God, you've got it figured out. You've got it figured out. I just gotta leave it.
And I think it's just like, when I think it's like you said it, you're being built. Like it's in those seasons you're being built, and I think sometimes we just focus so much on like, oh, this is the attack, or this is just so much, and I think like taming the tongue is so powerful. If anything, it's taught me like in the hard seasons that I'm like, all right, let's go. Like I just take it head on. If it's like, let's be honest, it is difficult. We can't say the words, it sucks. But I think ultimately what it's done is it's built you. Like it's giving you like a spiritual maturity for the next season and the next season. And I remember saying this, like, homes are funny because they do teach you a lot about like, your spiritual home. But I think any like big attack or big thing that you're going through, I just go, man, like we focus so much on the exterior, not taking on what's happening in our spirit. Like our spirit is being built. Our spirit is persevering. Our spirit is like, I feel like what God's doing in us is like, I'm giving you the words and the response for the next one. I'm giving you the wisdom for the next one. And then the next big season, He comes with like a whole slew of things that you're like, whoa, I didn't even know I need that. I needed that, Like I think from like the house to the indie situation, we were dealing with that simultaneously. Man, but we stood firm. We're like, no, God said that we're gonna have our home. God said we're gonna have a healthy daughter. Like, and we just kept like going in the spirit for these things and not focusing on the exterior. Yeah, Gio would show up every day, but like it did something.
It's definitely an invitation, and we don't see it that way. And I think it comes down to your mindset. I think if all your dreams and all your prayer life is constructed around the concept of blessing, favor, and arrival, then what you'll see this as a challenge, and not everything that's a challenge is actually just a challenge. It's not all that. It's sometimes an invitation for more. And Sarah, as I stood like in our house, we just fired the contractor because he was like stealing our finances. We had run out of space in the house we were living at. We were staying with family, and we ended up all living in a one bedroom. every one of our kids, all of us. You know, River was born, we're living in one bedroom, we're still running church, and I'm standing there, and then I get a call from the bank, and the bank tells me I've got 45 days to finish the house, or they will take whatever's left in the fund and keep it, because it's a FHA kind of program called 203K. And then I hang up with them. The old contractor calls me and he says, I'm going to put a lien on your house. I'm taking your house. You can't break a contract. You cannot fine me. Even though he's being dishonest. So I'm sitting there now, all of this is mounting up and I'm feeling overwhelmed. And then honestly, I think the number one thing came into mind is something that we were just teaching all of our college students, which was mental loops. And it was like assess, prioritize, execute, mental toughness. So I just thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I've got to tame, you know, Marlene said it so well, she tamed her tongue. I had to tame my mind. I had to actually stop feeling overwhelmed. I had to breathe deep and stop thinking about, it's a muscle to learn how to not focus on all that could go wrong.
Right. Yeah.
And simply ask yourself, what have I got to do next?
Right.
And I think that season was simply about putting the next foot in front of the other and knowing what was my immediate next step and just keep going and keep going. And I would get home at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, back up at 7 in the morning at the house, 4 in the morning, back at the house at 7 in the morning, sleep at the house, get up at 6 a.m. and keep going. Like, it was a crazy season. But I've often never known how to answer for people when they say, how do you increase capacity? And I'm like, honestly, I think the only way to increase capacity is the same way that you increase in fitness, which is you have to feel the burn and stay in that zone. That's your increase zone. Like when your heart rate is at a certain elevated point, everything from there is fitness gained. Getting to an elevated heart rate is not fitness. That you're not increasing fitness. You're just, nothing's happening there. It's when you get to the reps that you don't and can't go any further, and those elevated heartbeat moments, that's where you move. And so for us, I think I can now tell you how you build capacity. Get in over your head and learn how to rise above it. Because that's how you build capacity, right? It's how you build muscle. If the weight's not greater than what you can currently lift, you're not going to get to the next weight class. So you've got to keep going. And so I think if you keep looking, here are some mentalities to stay away from, talking about taming the mind, stay away from not backing yourself. Basically, if you feel like this is already bigger than you, you've already disqualified yourself, and you basically have placed yourself as an imposter in a challenge that is bigger than you and you do not belong in. You cannot go into this thinking, I don't belong here. The first thing you've got to go in believing is this is going to bring the bigger me out of me. I think the second thing you got to stay away from is thinking too many steps down the road and just think about, what do I do next? The third thing you've got to understand and tame is the failure voice. You're failing, you've done it, it's finished, it's over. And you've got to remember that there is no failing for as long as you keep learning and mixing learning with forward. One more step with yesterday's problem creates tomorrow's success. So you have to keep stacking those steps, stack those steps. And then I think the other mentality you've got to stay away from is, I want this to end. Start fighting back with the mentality of, I hope this lasts a year because, man, I'm going to be massive on the other side of this. If you look at every single run you do and you can't wait to finish at 5Ks and because you're doing a 5K, man, what happens if somebody asks you to go another K or you got to run again? But what if you were like, I could do 15 of these? That mentality is so different than the mentality that's going to quit. So for me, it was like, I can do this and more. That's what I kept telling myself. Like, I can do this and more. I can do this and more. I can do this and more. And I think any season where I've put myself through stretch, it's actually helped me build a capacity to manage stress. So you have to put yourself in a place to manage stress.
I think you also have to manage your own expectations, because I think whatever is going to knock you down is your own expectations of how a season is meant to play out.
Huge.
And I think the work is not bad. I think sometimes we kind of deliberate between, am I doing too much? Am I doing this on my own strength? Should God be doing this? And I think God is okay with us working. I think it's the mentality in which we put our hands to the plow that deciphers whether a season is going to be a beneficial one or one that's going to take us a lot longer to learn the lessons through. So I think it's everything that Chris said. It's like making sure your mindset is geared towards whatever God wants to do in you in that season through your application of work. And then I think another thing that we need to realize is sometimes we get so caught up and we're so enamored by growth, and growth is good. But I think what God wants more than growth is dependency.
Yeah, it's good.
He wants us to lean on him. He wants for us, and Chris asked yesterday, he's like, so where are you at with where we're currently at in our season with like selling the house and the kids and all the things? And I'm like, to be honest, I have just taken every single one of your messages and I've just decided to apply them. And I'm not going to get myself worked up in what hasn't happened in church or the numbers or all getting back to the pre-pandemic, stats. For me, I've just decided to do the next best thing, and I'm going to rest and let God do what he's going to do. And I think it's the expectation of, we got to do. And the moment I pick up my phone, it's like, we got to. It's like, no, chill out. Like, we've done everything we can do in a 24-hour period. You just rest and allow for God to do while you sleep or while you rest. Like Jimmy said a couple months ago in Grow Group, like, while we rest, he starts working. And I think we need to understand that, yes, we're growing, but we're also, the necessity for dependency on God is so important.
Yes, because I feel like for me, stretching capacity, like the achiever in me often wants to be like, it's like on me to get to the next side, and it's actually capacity stretching for me is often like, what am I still holding so much control over? I have to yield it to God to like stretch the capacity because I'm not meaning the dependency. Because like until I get out of my own way of like how I'm gonna do it, then usually I haven't figured out how he's actually asking me to grow.
Yeah. It's really good.
I just think of the season being like it's one of those like when it's hard, it's like I need to surrender this, because if not, like I'm literally like stressing myself through this. Like if I don't surrender the season, what's in front of me, the giant in front of me, like I will. These words these days are being I feel gassed, and I'm like, well, you're like it's speaking that way in your mind, and how much you're trying to hold on to this thing. Like you're literally like you just like put yourself through a season not even acknowledging like what he was
big time. And with that, like Oz and I were talking, because I was like, I found myself in a rut where I started to believe that the tone of my previous season was actually the reality of God and the level of my belief. And the way I would kind of phrase that is that how you receive a season will determine how you reframe your faith. And what I've noticed in people, right, is you have a few rough seasons, and I just don't know. What becomes dangerous is that you can no longer draw the line between what became the season that came to me and how much of me becoming a different believer perpetuated the season that I'm now stuck in. So you go for a season without financial abundance, and maybe God's building stewardship and he's building a whole bunch of things, but you don't receive it that way. Because how we receive messaging determines how we respond and how we feel and how we act, right? And so if I receive something wrong, now I'm angry at Jimmy, or I'm not happy with Shannon. But if I receive it right, she could have said it as a compliment and now I feel complimented. How you receive something determines how you reframe the relationship you're in. And I think that what we do is, if you don't receive it as, well, God's teaching me something, but yet he's still the God of abundance and I still have faith for it, you'll start actually faithing yourself into a rut. Because you'll start believing that this is what you deserve. You won't go to God for things. It'll affect the way you act on things. It'll affect what you run for. It'll affect what you look for. And then all of a sudden, because you believe that your life is encased by this, that's what you deserve, and that's just Chicago, and that's just ministry, then all of a sudden you don't even start to look for anything outside of it. You pass it by. You become afraid of it because you don't want more dejection. You don't want more rejection. So you just faith yourself into a rut. And I think it's important to make sure you receive a challenge in the spirit of an opportunity to grow, and then you continue to keep your faith at the at the direction of what you're going for. And I think it's so important to believe that the best is ahead for you. It's important to believe that. If you do not believe and know that God's got the best ahead for you, you're going to start actually determining that what you're in is just a reflection of more of what you're about to receive. I think it's a real dangerous place. And then you stop being a leader that inspires people. You stop being, and then you start living your own reality. It's just a really dangerous place to be. You got to receive it well so that you can respond adequately. We're pushing on the 10-minute mark, guys. We've got about 10 minutes left. What does this spark in you? What would you love to know? All questions, by the way. All questions are on. How do you lead in singleness? How do you lead at your workplace when you've got a boss that, I don't know, whatever it might be. Yeah, that's a really great question because we all want to have healthy cultures where people can feedback and you want healthy retort and dialogue. But it's like this, it's this real sweet spot, I think. It's like this really nice balance point, like anything in life, like riding a wave and digging an edge in, or finding the edge on your snowboard, or like any kind of bit of balance. And I think it can go from two extremes. And I think let's highlight them first, because I believe that definition lives in contrast and confirmation. And so I think, first of all, not saying anything, super bad, never going to work, okay? That's not going to be any good. But on the other side, I think, is like speaking and spewing about everything without there being an opportunity for feedback is the other extreme. So I think what we want is cultures that are willing to talk about it. Well, and then we've got to understand, what's the difference? Do you want to talk about it, or do you want to tell about it?
Yeah.
Because a teller never wants to hear.
Yeah.
And a teller never wants a solution. A teller wants agreement. A teller wants to be right. A teller has already assumed they're right. And a teller is telling you what you don't know yet. Or telling you what they just want to tell you. They don't even, it's maybe not about you, right, Brianna? Like it could be about, Sarah's my leader, let me go tell you. And it's cool. A teller does that. But a talker is looking for dialogue. A talker is looking to improve, correct, find their angle, find the right thing. So I think the number one thing we always want to have is we want to know where our heart's at. Both as the person receiving the conversation and the person giving the conversation. And I think some simple guides that are really extremely healthy is we should always be hoping that every conversation leads to better.
Yes.
If every conversation leads to better, we're in a safe place, right? If we understand each other better, if we can refine our processes better, if we can leave being better stewards of our leadership, better stewards of our tongue, if better is the goal, then that's one great marker. Another great marker is resolution. If there's no resolve or desire to resolve, it's not good. It's not healthy. Resolve doesn't always look like we become and stay and maintain people's best friends or even stay on teams. But resolve is we've come to a point where everybody can learn and glean, and we've received and we've picked this thing apart and each take what they need to take away. Yeah. It's a beautiful place to be. There should be resolution and restoration and resolve. I think that's really, really important. And I think if you've got growth, you've got resolve. And I think the other thing is the heart of forward. How does this take kingdom forward? Yeah, I think you want to be someone, if you're working in any level of organization or office, where you're seeing the gaps. I mean, that's awesome. That takes kingdom forward. Not everybody sees gaps. So, man, that's great. But when you start to see the gaps in a way where it affects your heart, instead of affecting the opportunity that maybe, like Stephen Lobo says, everyone's got their unique agitations, and maybe that's what your eye sees because your eye could fix it. Yeah. So if you come to a problem with a solution, that's awesome. That's like kingdom. And maybe you don't know the solution, but you got a heart for the solution. I think that is super, super, super brilliant and super important. I think if we can have conversation that way and ask ourselves, how's this making us better? How's it take forward? And the last thing I would say on that is I was watching this, I don't know if it was an Instagram or a TikTok, and it was this dude that walks around with the tiny little mics, and he interviews this dude. and he's about to interview this dude, and someone walks in front, and the interviewer gets frustrated, and this guy gives the most brilliant, unexpected answer, and I will not get it verbatim, but he goes, like the guy goes, can you believe some people? He goes, come on, man, he's probably just a person like us, walking around in his head with his problems, thinking about the same things that we think about, unaware of the world around him. We all live in an internal world, and we don't always know what's going on. And then he says, it's better to assume ignorance assume incompetence than malice. He goes, never put down to malice what you could put down to incompetence.
That's good.
And I was like, dang, this guy's just spitting truth and incredible things. And I thought, man, imagine if every moment that someone hurts us or there's opportunity for improvement, what if we put it down to incompetence, not malice? It has been my experience, when I interpret a gap as malice, it's got more to do with a previous wound of mine. I've been hurt in a situation like this before, and I think you're trying to hurt me. And usually it's not the case, you know. And in fact, I'm contemplating on a message that I'll give you a little precursor to, but I'm going to be doing a message just on, I really felt God just dropped this in my spirit from a scripture. I'm just speaking on people that have hurt you that you expected more from. And I felt like God gave me a real word for it. And if I don't preach it this weekend, I'll preach it next. But I really feel like it's a really freeing. I don't often get a word in this tone, and I really felt like God saying like I want to do some healing through this, and like it's a word to bring. And so a bit of what I shared is going to kind of be the tone of it. Lucky last. You can write it in the comment section. Go, Frankie. Yeah. I think that's a great question, and I think you don't have to throw them in off the deep end. Like, everybody can lead someone. And leadership isn't about arriving, right? So it's just simply, who could they be pouring into based on where they are and where the other people are? Like, everyone can just be a step ahead. And I think you start them with small things. Like, leadership looks like, in the youth perspective, like, hey, can you call these people and just save them a seat on Sunday? Like, that's their first thing of leadership. And I think if leadership is this thing that you release all at once, I think it's not very fruitful. If you release it all at once, basically you've not tested any. Leadership is a bunch of foundations. In fact, I would say leadership is very much like a high-rise building. And if you watch them come together, they build floor by floor. And I've always said that you will always crumble to your lowest, strongest foundation. So whatever last floor was constructed right, that's the one you're going to crumble to. So as you do gradual release of responsibility with leaders that you're developing, you're testing every floor. And after every floor, you add another floor and add another floor and add another floor. You don't become a leader of thousands overnight. You become a leader of ones and fives and tens and 20s and 50s and hundreds and thousands and then tens of thousands. That's how you do it. So if you're holding back, you've got to start gradually releasing and let them test every level, because it'll also reveal what needs to be fixed. You might not ever know that they need to grow in their confidence because you've never released them to talk to people in the foyer, because leadership is this massive thing where they go from you to leading 12. When the reality is they go from you to speaking to 12 before they go anywhere else. So keep gradually releasing the reins so that you slowly test the foundations. Well, guys, next week, what we'll do is this. You can come with your questions and you can write them in the chat. Gio's going to moderate, and I'm going to have Sarah moderate for us as well. Gio and Sarah, they're going to moderate. You guys can come with your questions. I mean, anything, something you've seen. If there's like a common video that you've seen circulating, and I don't know, you got ideas, whatever it is, any thoughts around leadership, we're going to talk them. It's been fun. So hey, you guys are awesome. We love you, and we will see you Sunday.